The next example really is one of my favorites in the sense that this was a $65,000 penetration test. And I can kind of understand why. The scope of the testing was huge, but the output that they got was terrible. It was so bad that I've put it across 2 slides. So in here, from something like 3,500 devices on a network across 20 or 30 different offices, there was 1 high vulnerability, 6 medium vulnerabilities, and 8 low vulnerabilities. Now, this company who carried this out, obviously I'm not going to name them, have a wonderful reputation, all the accreditations and certifications that you like, and the testers that are named on this report, I actually have huge respect for them. I thought they were very good. Unfortunately, this output is pretty bad. The one high finding that's in this report is something called Suite 32 SSL finding.
Hi, William. Thank you for being on today's episode. Just as a way to get things going, mate, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yep. So for those of you who don't know, I'm William Wright, CEO of Closed Door Security. For the past 20 years, I've been working in IT and in cybersecurity. My career history really mainly focuses on defense and the Ministry of Defense and NATO, working with like BAE and Kinetic, doing a lot of maritime work with them. Also did some work for NATO in Belgium, and then about 5-6 years ago set up Closed Door Security from my kitchen table in my house in Babel on the Isle of Lewis. And for those that don't know, that's a tiny little island off the north coast of Scotland, which was not really a great place to start a business, but hey, you live and learn. My wife also, because we had such a small house, used to hate it because on the kitchen table would be all my kit, and she would have to clean it all up in order to get dinner out, and then I would have to put it all back to continue working. A few years ago, I became the first ever chartered cybersecurity professional in Scotland. I've got all the usual certs and accreditations that you would expect from a penetration tester. I'm also a member of CREST's UK Council, and we do a lot of work globally. We have offices in the US and in the UAE. So I spend a lot of my time traveling all around doing pen tests and doing a lot of outreach work and presentations and conferences on penetration testing.
That's exactly what's brought us together in this conversation, because we're going to unpack quite a fun sort of topic, but pen testing, you got a bit of it's got to be in your bonnet about this. No one's getting bang for their buck at the moment, are they? Or have been?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Think there's almost like a split market in penetration testing. You have the very few companies that do it right, and I'm sure pretty much everybody knows their names. They've got fantastic reputations, massively skilled staff, and then you've got everybody else. And the vast majority of everybody else doesn't have a clue what they're doing. Is selling absolute rubbish, and unfortunately the people and businesses buying what they are selling think they're being secured, but they're not. They are usually getting automated output or low-skilled output with absolutely no technical knowledge or application to the business actually to back it up. One of the sort of the most prominent examples that I see throughout when it comes to poor quality pen testing is either they're just going to run a vulnerability scan and they're going to call it a pen test, and they're going to charge you, the grand sum of £10,000 to run a vulnerability assessment. Or you're going to get an actual penetration test, but the person doing it doesn't understand what it is they're doing, and therefore you just end up getting a vulnerability assessment again. So those kind of are the real bugbears, and the problem being is when a reputable company comes along afterwards, it's really difficult to open that conversation with a company. So say, for example, you had paid £5,000 for what was called a penetration test, and then a reputable company comes along and says, well, actually, a proper penetration test is going to be £50,000. You're immediately going to go, well, I got it for five grand last time. Why am I going to pay you 50? It's the exact same thing. So I spend a lot of time, I'm going to conferences, as I said, doing outreach and workshops, trying to educate people on what this proper process looks like. That doesn't mean vulnerability assessments don't have their place. They do, absolutely. And security journey and implementation and overall kind of cybersecurity framework, vulnerability assessments absolutely have their place. But what you tend to see is a lot of people buying penetration tests and a lot of people selling penetration tests, which actually under the bonnet is just vulnerability assessments.
So I guess, Matt, like how do you start to kind of tell the difference there? Because it's almost like, you're kind of saying cola versus Coke. Yeah. And then kind of to your point there, it's all about expectation setting. If somebody's come to market first time they bought some sort of pen test service and they go, like I said, oh, it's 10 grand for this. And it's, it's full platinum sort of level service. That's their expectation. If somebody comes back and goes, well, absolutely not, kind of causes a bit of a conflict internally because you're challenging their expectations of what a pen test service should be, for one. And for two, usually you're talking with the person that made the original decision in the first place, and now you're challenging sort of their ability. So, what the customers need to look for, and like, how do you start to tell the difference between that cola versus full Coke?
Yeah, I think the one thing to make pretty clear here is there is very little signposting for penetration testing. So if you just now go on and have a look at Google and search for pen testing, the results you're going to get, the top 10 are just going to be who's paying the most for the spot. And when you look at actual signposting, there's a few organizations in the UK that help. So like the NCSC, they've got the check scheme, and some of the local sort of business resilience centres do have signposting for local services. But really, the education piece, and from a sales perspective, if you're having to re-educate a customer on what it is that they need to buy, that's already a different journey than it is just having an initial sales conversation. You've got to somehow not step on the ego of somebody who's bought this and thinks they have exactly what they want, but whilst also reiterating that what they're trying to achieve might not necessarily have been achieved, and therefore they've paid for something that they might not necessarily want. And you said before we started recording, the used car salesman kind of thing. You've bought a car that goes 0 to 60 in a few seconds, but as soon as you get in and drive it, it's actually, oh, wait a minute, this takes about 10 minutes to get there. And pen testing can very much be the same in that you don't know until you actually buy it, realistically. So there is some due diligence that you can do. There is some things that you can check. But until you actually go through the experience, you don't know if the company you've brought in is any good. So some of the things that you can check for is CREST pen test. That's a pretty good standard accreditation that CREST themselves as an organization will make sure that the business is following specific methodologies and make sure they have all the relevant assurances, accreditations, etc. Also looking at the individual testers' certifications. Now, I'm not any kind of certification junkie in the sense that everybody must have OSCP and stuff. I don't believe that, but you can 9 times out of 10 indicate whether somebody has been around the block a few times and knows what they're doing, or whether they're just chancing it based on what certifications they've got in pen testing. In the UK specifically, anybody who is working in Czech or in public sector is going to be either CREST CRT or CyberScheme CSTM. At a very basic level, the team leads might be up to higher certifications, but on an individual level, you can then see, okay, the testers assigned to my project, what certifications do they have? Now, one of the other things you can do is ask for references. Now, that's something that a lot of pen test companies don't offer, and I understand why. Because if you've had a pen test done, you probably don't want to shout about it, especially if they found something interesting. Let's call it interesting. You're not really going to want to advertise that fact. But certainly customers that we have and their happiness and satisfaction with what we've done as really means that they're quite happy to give references to people who are inquiring. So I have no doubt that more reputable companies will have those references that they can go off and give to people. But aside from that, it is doing some research on the company, and your usual sort of procurement due diligence is pretty standard. But you are kind of taking a chance in the sense that, as I said, you don't really know until you go through with it. But there are, once you get to the end, there's some indicators. So once you actually see the output, there is some indicators where you can almost retrospectively look and go, have I been done here? I think this is probably a natural point to share some examples, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're going to do something different on today's episode. We're going to share an actual pen test report, aren't we? So let's go through this, because I think the story behind this is actually quite, it's got some character, let's just say.
Yeah. So obviously I can't go into too much detail because these are actual reports. But one of the really big denominators in looking at the difference between a pen test and vulnerability assessment, depending on what you've bought, is the report. If, for those that can't see the video, if it has Tenable Nessus anywhere on the report, or if it has Qualys anywhere on the report, or if it follows a structure that looks like either of those products. Now you can view images of the default report templates on Google very easily. Then that's probably a massive red flag. You've probably been missold a pen test. Now, as I said earlier, the vulnerability assessments have a place. Tenable, Nessus, Qualys, all those vulnerability assessment tools are wonderful tools. They will be part of a penetration test, but they won't be the only thing. So if you've paid for a vulnerability scan and you get this, whilst it's not how we would do it, it's still likely a legitimate output. But in a penetration test, if somebody presented this to me, it's Tenable Nessus, they've not even branded it or anything. Some do, some don't. It's a very, very big question of what have you actually done here for the money which is being paid. Now, a bit more of an interesting example. So this is excerpts of a report carried out on a bank on their internet banking platform. So the entire output is 2 findings. So again, for those who can't see the video, there's 2 findings in here. We've got a high risk no anti-CSRF token, and we've got a medium risk incorrect credentials accepted. Now, at face value, those look pretty bad. If we're doing a proper penetration test of an internet banking platform, the chances of there only being 2 things and of that severity is very unlikely. What's also interesting is when we went into more detail, and this is where the technical aspect of pen testing comes in is very important. The incorrect credentials being accepted that's mentioned in this report is actually just a persistent session. So when somebody logs in to a web page, a web application, whatever, they put their credentials in and it creates a session cookie. Now, if you log out and refresh the page and it logs you back in, it's called a persistent session. There's a few different ways of describing it, but that's one way. And what they found was actually this. But what they didn't realize is when they were doing the test, they were just putting in random credentials to see if it would work. So they thought that putting in random credentials logged you in as somebody else. The chances of that being an applicable vulnerability are so slim and so unlikely, especially in an internet banking platform, that it just seems unreasonable. So the fact that the tester who wrote it, the QA personnel who QA'd it, and the manager who released it all thought that was valid kind of brings into question their experience with actually carrying out penetration testing on web apps. So, but what was more interesting on this is down in the bottom right of this screen is this is a screenshot as part of the output of the burp vulnerability assessment. So burp's active scan. And in that is, again, it's just a vulnerability assessment with a bunch of high, medium, low informational things. And they've used that as evidence of the work that they've actually done. Now, to really hit home with this example, we then did a penetration test on the exact same bit of infrastructure. There was an IDOR in the application. For those that don't know, that basically is if you directly use a URL, you can access something you shouldn't have access to simplify it a lot. And what that did is it allowed you to see the transactions of anybody's bank account. So literally anybody, all you needed was the numeric profile ID, which was a 12-digit string. And you could brute force that because they didn't have any brute force protections or any rate limiting. So it's really low-hanging fruit, really basic stuff. And, with first off, it's a financial application. Secondly, it's exposed to the internet. The risks that wasn't detected are obviously significant. The company or the incumbent that we replaced had been there for 4 years. And over 4 years, they hadn't discovered this. The bank themselves who had been purchasing that were at a massive risk just because they didn't know that. And it doesn't make sense. They were paying the right amount of money. Their procurement processes as a bank, as a financial institution, were pretty robust. Problem was the people who were doing it just weren't very good. So that's another thing to watch out for, is contextually, if you're looking at a penetration test, the output should match what you kind of expect. And if there's not much output, you should definitely be questioning it. That doesn't mean it wasn't done properly, but there should be a question of, okay, there's not much here, what have you done? The next example really is one of my favorites, in the sense that this was a $65,000 penetration test. And I can kind of understand why. The scope of the testing was huge, but the output that they got was terrible. It was so bad that I've put it across 2 slides. So in here, from something like 3,500 devices on a network across 20 or 30 different offices, there was 1 high vulnerability, 6 medium vulnerabilities, and 8 low vulnerabilities. Now, this company who carried this out, obviously I'm not going to name them, have a wonderful reputation, all the accreditations and certifications that you like, and the testers that are named on this report, I actually have huge respect for them. I thought they were very good. Unfortunately, this output is pretty bad. The one high finding that's in this report is something called Suite 32 SSL finding. Now, anybody who's run a vulnerability scan before in their life will know exactly what that is, how it's not really a high risk, and how it flags up on so many things. It's relatively straightforward to fix as well. It definitely should be highlighted as part of a pen test, but on a piece of infrastructure that big, with the scope being so wide, the fact that that's the only high vulnerability really opens up some questions as to what was actually going on. But thankfully, they told you exactly what's going on, in the sense that their entire report, all something like 100 pages of that, 60 odd pages were just output of what they did. And again, for those who can't see the video, there's a contents table, and the contents table is step by step what they went off and did, with screenshots of things like trying to brute force logins, etc., etc. Now, you would think that's probably a good thing to do. In some instances, yes, especially if you pay for it. If you're doing a red team and you expect event logging and data tracing and stuff, that's kind of expected. But when you've spent just as long writing this report as you have doing the actual testing and still found nothing, it does raise a lot of questions here. Why is there so much output in here showing things that you couldn't find? And the irony is, in their output was actually a number of things which were vulnerabilities. As soon as you go on the network, ran responder, NTLM relay, you're getting credentials left, right, and center. Really easy to move throughout the network. I have no idea how they missed it, but there's in the table of contents here, there's something, it's listed as figure 67, which is adding a domain admin account. Now, this really drew my attention, is they've done step by step how they were able to add a domain admin account, and how the account could do DC sync, and actually how they could do everything, but none of that is actually a finding. So they've given step by step, here's how they managed to exploit it, add a domain admin account, use DC sync, and move laterally throughout the network with lower privilege accounts, but none of that is highlighted a vulnerability. And the question becomes, why isn't it a vulnerability? The execs, the CISOs, the technical team, they're not going to read through all this stuff. They're going to go straight to the vulnerabilities. They're going to look at, okay, this one high, whatever it was, mediums, I forgot already, and lows, and start to work on them, thinking everything's fine from that. So when we actually read through the detail, that was one example. There was loads of examples. There's even Log4j on the network. There was so many examples of things that they missed. There was no EDR, no MDR, no SOC, no SIEM, nothing monitoring us. It was a very, very comprehensive pen test, let's call it that. So realistically, this customer paid $65,000, and they got a step-by-step guide of how not to do a pen test. So it's a really interesting example to use because everything lined up there perfectly to say this should be a good pen test. The company was great, the testers were great, everything seemed to be professional, their due diligence checked out. It just didn't actually follow through in the end. And the CISO, once I had the conversation with them after hours, the problem he had was now he's got to justify why they spent $65,000 on this super reputable company, and then we've come along at the time, you know, relative newcomers to the scene. What's the difference? What's going on? Why has this happened? So yeah, it's an interesting thing, and that's some examples to actually go through and maybe go back to, if anybody's listening and has had a pen test done recently, is just go back and think about the output that you had. Does that actually make sense? Is it what we wanted? Does it kind of correlate to the network that we're looking at? You know, if you run a vulnerability scan yourself and you find more stuff that's in the pen test report, it's definitely some questions to ask there. So yeah.
It kind of comes back to what we were talking about before, expectations, things like that. But I mean, that outright there, what there were 73 figures in that 73 screenshots of stuff that they have.
It's not just 73 screenshots, that's 73 different steps. So each of those figures had multiple screenshots and multiple command outputs.
Wow.
It's just pages and pages of.
It's almost like a bit of another tactic, though, isn't it, in terms of information overload? Because, like you said, the C-suite are just going to look at that exec report. They're going to look at the one page. Oh, we've only got one high. Fair enough. And I guess you have to think of it from, you know, from the other side of the table. Yeah, if you're that pen testing company, you've been there for 4 years, you are the incumbent. You always want to be. It's a weird one, isn't it? Because you always want to be doing right by your customer if you're that pen tester, and doing right by it is by reducing the amount of vulnerabilities that come from these reports, but you can't sweep it underneath the rug to make you look good to protect that contract. You're better off having a bit more of a difficult conversation and saying, even if you missed it on the last report, just say, sorry, we missed on the last one. Here you go. But like, yeah, there's a lot of trust put in, and it's not necessarily always returned, is it? But it's not always easy to decipher if you're having the wool pulled over your eyes a little bit there.
Yeah. And even some larger companies who have their own internal pen test teams, I have seen this as an example, is the internal pen test team unfortunately wasn't very skilled or experienced, and they were hiring similarly experienced people externally to do the third party testing. So you had really low experienced pen testers being pen tested by really low experienced pen testers. And it just creates this circle of, well, you know, internally management is being told that everything's good. And when that ransomware event inevitably did happen, there was so many questions as to, okay, but we've been getting pen tested. Why has this happened? And that's the actual, you know, if we go away from the kind of throwing muck at pen testers, and it's really easy to do that. The issue is the entire purpose of a pen test is supposed to identify the risks before somebody else does. Like, we're supposed to be finding the problems so that the teams can go off and fix them. If you're not finding the problems, they can't fix them. And that means that they live in this false sense of security. And as executives and upper management of larger enterprises will know, risk acceptance is fine. You know, you accept risks as part of business. But not knowing about a risk is unacceptable. You should know about all the risks. Do they need to be documented? Yes, arguably. You know, there's laws that say you do need to do that, and frameworks that say you need to do that. But as long as somebody is aware of the risk and they have accepted or are in the process of mitigating it, then at least you can say that you were doing some work, you were trying. If you don't even know about it, you can't do anything about it. So, like when that ransomware event does happen, it's blindsided.
Would you say that's more of the, I guess, the impact from these weaker pen tests, right? It's not just a monetary loss, because frankly, money's money, right? Comes and goes, whatever. It's more the fact that it is that unknown, and unless you are aware of it, this is like those kind of situations you just get blindsided in. You're getting phone calls at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning because something's happened, because you had absolutely no idea that you had this massive hole in your infrastructure or your environment.
Yeah, and there's this balancing act as well. So pen testing can get really expensive, and it's quite easy to go and spend hundreds of thousands of pounds to get a fully comprehensive red team done, threat-led pen testing, etc. That's it's very easy to do that, but there is also a balancing act to play here in the sense of not every business has that budget. And as a consultant and as a pen tester, you should be able to act within the boundaries that you're given as best as you possibly can. Unfortunately, there's just no way that you can do that properly unless you are suitably experienced and qualified. Otherwise, you might as well run Qualys. You might as well just spend the £1,000 cough and get a Qualys or Nessus license and run it. You might as well just do that yourself rather than go out and getting a third party to do it. It would be money better spent and it would be time better invested. But the entire premise of pen testing is supposed to be preventative. It's not supposed to be reactive. And a cybersecurity framework and an institution within a business should be preventative and not react.
I think you're right in saying like anything to do with cybersecurity, right? How far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? And everybody, has that different level, I guess. So let's take a step back. You're not the CEO now of Closed Door. Back in the old days, and you sat there and you're going, right, I've got to do a pen test. How can I spot red flags? I'm going to go out to market. I'm going to ask all these. I'm going to go after reputable ones. I might go after some challengers. I might go after, services that I know that my mates use in their organizations, things like that. What are those kind of red flags that you can spot? Because I guess that's the first point. And then the second point is, like you said, like how far down that do you go? Based on obviously, budgets, resources, everything that you have at your disposal, right?
Yeah.
So how do you spot them?
I think there's one really good denominator, and that is if a company does everything, they do nothing. So if you're looking at an MSP to do your pen testing that has 10,000 services listed on their website, they're probably not experts at all of those things, which means they're either subcontracting in somebody or they're just doing it with whatever skill sets they have in-house. Nothing wrong with subcontracting, it has its place, but usually you're not vetting the subcontractor, they're vetting it. So you don't get to actually go through your due diligence and make sure that that's a subcontractor that you want to use. Accreditations is another one. So like I mentioned, CREST pen test, NCSC check, Dubai Cyberforce in the UAE. There's a whole bunch of other ones across the world, depending on where you are. It will be the most applicable. Most governments will signpost them if you're searching for services. But again, the biggest one is probably going to be references as well. So references from previous companies similar to yourself in a similar vertical or industry that specific company has worked with. I've noticed, obviously being involved in sales and cybersecurity because of what I do, a lot of selling is reputational based. So I will quite often speak with customers who have been recommended from a previous customer that we've worked with because the CISOs of those two businesses have talked to each other and went, actually, these guys were all right. And I know there's tens of thousands of examples of companies all over the world that happens, where good work, reputation, it spreads. Cybersecurity is kind of unique in that the community is very small. If you go into engineering or if you go into medical, it's massive. You could spend your entire life and never meet the same person twice. If you look at cybersecurity, just in the UK, for example, almost everybody knows everybody. Or you're no more than 2 degrees of separation away. There's somebody who knows you, who knows that person that you're trying to speak to. So word spreads really fast about good, but it also spreads really fast about bad. So if you are in a situation where you're wanting to buy penetration testing, I would suggest just going to your network, find 5 random people, CISOs, and maybe cybersecurity managers, whatever, enterprises or businesses similar to yours, and ask who they use. I'm no doubt that they would be more than happy to tell you who they are, because either they've had a great experience and want you to use them, or they've had a really bad experience and want to tell you not to use them. So that can be a really good way of doing it. I would recommend that.
What would you just something that that's what we chatted about just before the episode as well. I think you called it threat-led testing as well. It was something a little bit more different, I guess, as you said, to the whole like just vulnerability scanning. But that in itself, I would assume that if somebody is taking that kind of approach to pen testing, they probably got a little bit more nous and experience about what they're doing. So I guess, Can you just give a quick overview to what you define as, I guess as a threat-led testing, because that will come across in any sort of proposal that lands on anybody's desk?
Yeah, so threat-led pen testing is something that kind of came out of the Central Bank of England, and what it is it's kind of like red teaming, but not really. The intention is to take specific APTs and specific TTPs, which are threats or state actors or attackers, and simulate them against the business. Anybody who's fallen within DORA regulations will know all about it because it's currently an absolute mess trying to figure out what applies. But basically what threat-led pen testing is trying to do is trying to steer more specific threats and therefore steer your specific remediations. So rather than just doing like a 5 days internal pen test, that's a really common scope. 5 days internal pen test. What you say instead is you say, okay, I've got 3 threats that we're going to emulate. Maybe a ransomware group, an insider threat, and I don't know, financial fraudster, something like that. Mm-hmm. And then you model the TTPs most common in that industry. So for a ransomware group, it might be things like NTLM relay. It could be credentials on the dark web that they used for authorized access. And essentially you're working through the attack matrix to find the exact chain to see where the most common things are. You then run those attacks against the organization, first off as a kind of blind test. How far can you go? And then if you want to go a bit further, you do it as from a defense in depth perspective. So you go, okay, I can get this far from the outside, but what happens if I'm on the inside? And, you work with, almost in a sort of purple teamy way, you work with the internal team and say, okay, right, put me here, now where can I go? Put me over there, now where can I go? And you start to explore things like that. Now that is the next level of pen testing, and something that I'm doing just now quite heavily is trying to bring that type of testing to the small and medium enterprises. So trying to find a cost-effective way of delivering that, because I think that is super valuable. Obviously, your financial institutions have endless budgets. They have all the money. They can go off and do the full red teaming and threat-led pen testing. So I'm working on a way, and I've been working with a number of our customers to deliver these simulated threats which are applicable to them. And so far it's going really good. It's given them great output, and it's letting them actually focus on what matters to fix for their business, rather than just saying, okay, we've got 1,000 vulnerabilities, start from the top and let's work our way down. They can actually go, okay, these ones are actually exploitable just now. Let's focus on them first and work through the rest in due course.
Prioritization and effectively low-hanging fruit, what's going to be the quickest with the biggest impact to the business in terms of...
Exactly. And traditional pen testing won't always pick up these things. And certainly, most likely, won't report it in a way that you can understand that those are key things that you want to address.
I'll tell you what, Will, I'll catch up with you in a couple of months' time. I want to see how that's doing, because it'd be quite good to listen to some of those different case studies and obviously what you've managed to do with your customers, right?
Yeah. I'd be very happy to.
Really appreciate you being on today. Ultimately, if in terms of advice for our listeners, review, right? Like because it's from a reputable company, make sure they got the accreditation debts. I guess be aware that there's going to be smoke and mirrors sometimes, or things aren't going to report in the way you expect. And like you said, if it looks too good to be true sometimes on the level of vulnerabilities that have been shown, probably because it is a bit too good to be true. So query it and question it. But if you had 3 key takeaways, I guess, for people today, fire them away. What do you think they need to think about when it comes to pen testing services?
So I think the key one is pen testing's place within your cybersecurity implementation. It should be almost at the end. When you're doing a pen test, almost all of the changes should be done. There should be no major infrastructure changes. You should be looking at a point in time where it's pretty clear that nothing's going to change for a couple of weeks minimum, maybe a couple of months. That's the first thing. A lot of people bring it in too early in the journey and end up invalidating everything. So, you'll do a pen test, and halfway through the pen test, half the infrastructure will disappear because they've just decommissioned it. So, okay. You've not just wasted your own time and money, but you're also wasting the testers' time when they could have been concentrating on other things, finding other stuff. Secondly, again, I reiterate, look at accreditations. Businesses who have actually gone through and got the accreditations relevant to what they're doing have invested a lot of time and money in it because they know the value of it. CREST Pentest being one of them. If you're in financial industry, StarFS, CBEST, across the EU, the US, there's different ones, but the time, money, and skill that goes into getting them is pretty extensive, and it is a really good denominator of who's good and who's not. And then lastly, references. I think too many people don't ask for references from pen testing companies. I think a lot more people should be, and you probably find a lot of companies will disappear because of that.
Great bits of advice. Hey, if anybody wants to reach out to you, kind of ask you a bit of advice, perhaps they're going through the same thing, or like you said, they're going to start evaluating at some point. How can people reach out to you, mate?
So probably the easiest way is LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, but the website's there, cdsec.co.uk. And also email william@cdsec.co.uk, or by phone, old-fashioned phone. We're on 0131 460 4180.
Well, thank you very much for being on today's episode. It's been fantastic listening.
Pleasure, James.
Your stories about pen testing, and really looking forward to have you back on.